Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this morning. It's 9 o'clock, so we're going to get started here. Before I begin, I just wanted to let everyone know that all of the sessions over the next 4 days can be accessed through our full program that you should have received in your email or through the reminder emails that will be sent out each morning of the forum this week. If you have any issues over the course of the next few days, please email events@invasivespeciescenter.ca and we'll get you fixed up and ready to go. So before I introduce our first speaker of the day, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you this morning from the Robinson Huron Treaty Territory, and the land on which I sit is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. Long before today, there have been Aboriginal peoples who have been the stewards of this place. I recommend that you take a moment today to acknowledge the traditional territory in which you reside and recognize the contributions of the Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples have made both in shaping and strengthening our own communities and our province and country as a whole. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, who I've been honored to have met in organizing this forum, and I'm happy to introduce Mr. Gary Pritchard. Gary is a conservation ecologist and Indigenous engagement and placemaking specialist from Curve Lake First Nation, Ontario. Gary has had the privilege to work on behalf of Indigenous people throughout Ontario and Canada and has traveled to almost 300 Indigenous communities throughout Canada and the northern United States. He's brought a wealth of knowledge to both his Indigenous and non-Indigenous clientele, performing a wide variety of services, including Indigenous community planning, land use traditional knowledge studies, Indigenous lead conservation and restoration, ecological monitoring using two-eyed seeing, Indigenous placemaking, capacity building, expert testimony, mediation between Western science and traditional science, and subject matter expert on behalf of Indigenous communities. Gary loves to connect and educate people through nature. He does this through several mediums. His favorite way is through his wildlife photography and storytelling. He believes that if individuals, especially youth, can form a connection with nature, then all people can make conscious decisions on how we impact Mother Earth and the next 7 generations. Gary likes to spend much of his free time educating youth about all our relations, with his most favorite students being his 2 children. One of Gary's greatest strengths is that he is often able to be the one who acts as a bridge between the Indigenous community and the Western style of governance. Gary has successfully collaborated with many stakeholder groups, researchers, institutes, government agencies, Indigenous communities, and political organizations to address environmental concerns and identify practical solutions to environmental related issues. So Gary, I will share your presentation now, and you can take it away.
Great, thanks, Mackenzie. Okay, hi everybody, welcome. So this is actually Indigenous placemaking and ethical space. And these are 2 things I get involved in quite a bit in my daily life when I do conservation projects. And it's one of the things that I think we need to be doing is actually making sure we're using the right terms when we create these different platforms to do projects within conservation, and we just need to make sure we're saying the right things. And I always like to start off with this quote that we are all Indigenous people on this planet. We all have, and we now have to reorganize our thinking on how to get along. And I think that's what we need to do to help reconcile with the Indigenous people as well as our place in nature. And Mackenzie, I'll take the next slide, please. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm in my traditional territory, which is the Williams Treaty First Nations community. We're both the Chippewa and Mississauga communities. I'm actually in my home in Treaty 18. And yeah, before we begin, I also like to open by asking us all to come together with an open heart, open mind, and open ears. And we share respect with each other while we're in this space together so that we can all listen to what each other are saying and take away something that we can share with other people that we get to work with and that we get to enjoy nature with. Also, too, I like to share the Anishinaabe teaching of invasive species, and it's not as negative as I often see when I use my Western science side of my brain, but it's actually to understand and welcome these newcomers and why do they migrate to our lands and how can they be a part of our ecosystems. It's not so much of a negative. Invasive species are now here and we need to eradicate them, but how we need to understand their place within nature. And with that, I think we'll just take it away from here. Mackenzie, I'll take the next slide, please. So what we're going to do while we're together today, because I go to a lot of webinars and a lot of different meeting platforms, I'm going to create kind of like a virtual learning place. So everybody has the ability to ask questions in the chat, hopefully. And Mackenzie's going to help me navigate the chat while we're doing this presentation together. I'm going to ask some questions so people can respond to, so that they can be a little bit more interactive. So I call it the virtual learning place, is what since I spend most of my time in a virtual setting now instead of in person. But what we're going to talk about today is understanding what is ethical space and placemaking, since it is a conversation topic that keeps coming up, and how do we do this through Indigenous-led conservation. I often call this the slowing down and avoiding the project dumpster fire. I usually get brought in when the project is a raging dumpster fire and I'm expected to fix it, but I'm going to hopefully give people some tips on how to avoid that and what you should consider prior to venturing it on your own on your next project. And then I have some questions at the end. We're going to close. I call it the virtual fireside chat, because typically when we do outdoor ed teachings, we actually like to have a fire and wrap the workshops up, but we can't do that obviously in our virtual setting. And so, yeah, but I also like this point too, is that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada defines reconciliation as an ongoing process to establishing and maintaining long-term relationships, and that's really important as we start down looking at doing this work collaboratively together. And hopefully we can get some of those points out today when we're virtually talking. And I'll take the next slide, please. So before I really get into the meat and potatoes of it, I always like to acknowledge people who've been meaningful in my life, and I like to acknowledge. I was taught these methods of learning from Dr. Reg Croshew and Elder Larry McDermott, and I'm very fortunate to get to spend a lot of my time learning from Larry, especially, and he really helps me understand my role in conservation and also how to help people. Which is some of these topics, and I'm very fortunate, and always like sharing that too with everybody, so that there's other people out there that you know to reach out to that can help guide you on your reconciliation and conservation journeys. Next slide, please. So before we begin, I always like to tell people that this isn't the one size fits all. Remember that Canada is a very vast and diverse country, and each region has its distinct opportunities and challenges when you start doing conservation strategies. If you look at BC, it's largely without treaty. Quebec has its unique civil laws and historical realities, and Ontario has some of the oldest and most difficult colonial treaties to work within. And of course, just like this country, the Indigenous people that live across it are just as diverse as the country is itself. Next slide, please. So when we start looking at defining ethical space and Indigenous placemaking, please understand that these two terms are not truly the same. People tend to actually start using them all the time as like collective of one, and they're actually not that at all. They're very much different, and they tend to use the wrong term in a gathering situation, and these terms actually start leading an outcome that is not desired by both the Indigenous community as well as the non-Indigenous community. And each has their own specific role and place in the reconciliation with Indigenous people, and we just need to start looking at doing that in the right way. Next slide, please. So what is ethical space? In June 2017, Elder Croshew and Elder Larry McDermott led members of the Indigenous Circle of Experts, or ICE, in a pipe ceremony to demonstrate the intent to collaborate and co-create an ethical space to work together over the course of the following year to help create the pathway targets. For some members of the committee, the pipe ceremony was new and unknown, but opened the hearts of all who participated to doing what we need to do in a good way. So how do you define ethical space? That's a question that a lot of my Western science colleagues ask me, and we tried, Larry and I try to create some examples. But the focus of ethical space is on creating a place for knowledge systems to interact with mutual respect, kindness, generosity, and other basic values and principles. All knowledge systems are equal, and no single system has more weight or legitimacy than the other. One system does not need to collaborate to achieve the internal validity of that knowledge system. And for example, it doesn't have to be written down or proven in an archaeological study to be given as evidence or as proof. And it will have the same validity as Indigenous storytelling. Next slide, please. While to formally agree to enter an ethical space, it might be a straightforward process that people think of for the most part, and most parties like, yeah, we need to enter into ethical space. But actually being within that space together requires a lot of flexibility and maneuverability through a project, and that's one of the things where people frequently get hung up on, and parties may frequently to adjust to different factors or surprises that we never envisioned in the beginning when we were mapping this whole project out in the first place. And that's where the real challenge actually becomes when we start is actually working together throughout the whole process. Next slide, please. So I'm going to open up to the floor to my first question. So what do you think I was really meaning by this statement? Let's see if I can look at the chat. Mackenzie, I'm going to ask your help too.
For sure.
We'll give a few minutes. Yeah, I'll let you take over there for a second.
Sure. To the audience, you can submit into the question box.
So to reiterate, the question is, why do we need to adjust to change, and how is that difficult? So kids, I'm going to ask you if you're actually seeing anything, because I don't see anything.
I'm not seeing anything coming yet. Haven't seen anything yet, Gary.
Sorry, I was muted there. So we can move on to the next question, but it really is, and I'll just keep going on this statement before we move to the next slide, but the whole, we're so hardwired to actually leave a project framework. I find it funny because the other day, I'd never do this, but I even in my personal project life asked for a Gantt chart, and I never asked for a Gantt chart because I know projects constantly evolve and change. And I'm like, I need a Gantt chart so bad, just to kind of organize myself and where everybody foresees things happening. But we're so hardwired through Western science to stick to that Gantt chart and to start feeling uneasement and anxiety when we start deferring from that Gantt chart, that we really need to start opening our minds to and just to be more flexible when we start going down this road. And hopefully we can start doing that together. And I'll take the next slide, please.
Gary, I actually had a question come in here.
Sure.
While you were talking. So Dan Rowlandson says, there has been considerable change lately. Selecting what change we can influence has been difficult.
Okay, that's more of a statement. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't read it before I
okay.
but it was.
And that's true, right? Like it is very, I look at my work and how we change everything from territory to territory. It is really hard, right? I look at my own community area and our traditional territory, and we're actually figuring out what we would like to see happening on the landscape from multiple angles. And it is hard, and it's that whole, we need to be more open when we get together, and this is why I always flag it as an area of concern, is that it's one thing to say we're going to enter that space, but then what actually happens is that we tend to dominate that space with one knowledge system, or leading towards more of a Western science. Is we need to actually look at a more even participation. Next slide, please. Oop. So yeah, oh, there we go. That's the one. So while we engage in ethical space, no party can claim to achieve or even entered it, because it's not the process of consultation or accommodation that's defined under legislation or Section 35. That's not the purpose of ethical space. So that's one of the things that we need to start separating. And I see as we go down that path of conservation and working together, you'll see a complete divide between ethical space and understand the rights of Indigenous people under Section 35. So the ethical space part is really understanding that co-management and how do we work together. With this opportunity comes risk. Indigenous people are understandably hesitant to rebuild or establish relationships of trust with Indigenous or non-Indigenous forms of government. You know, the removal of lands, traditional territories, water still resonates within the lives of Indigenous people. And in addition, Indigenous knowledge systems, language, customs, and protocols and practices have never been respected at the table. And that's one of the things that we often clearly see when we get together. I look at different projects I've had where I've identified my family's traditional knowledge, and because Western science doesn't say the same thing, or they did, you know, 20 or 30 years ago, now that I'm getting older, and it's been forgotten, they don't collaborate in the same way, and that's one of the things that we need to work on to progress the envelope to move it forward. Next slide, please. So two-eyed seeing in ethical space. Ethical space cannot be achieved without two-eyed seeing, which is both the practice of learning to see with two knowledge systems or drawing on both a discovery guide and problem solving. It's within ethical space that collaboration, mutual support, and multi-directional knowledge sharing can occur. So I often ask Larry how to explain that to people, and ethical space is part of how our country came together, practiced in 1764 in the treaty making process. Ethical space is essentially based on our laws. John Burroughs, the famous author and lawyer, actually calls it the gifts, which are the 7 sacred teachings: the love, humility, courage, generosity, respect, truth, and wisdom. Wisdom comes last, and love comes first, as the creator, the Great Spirit, has always shown love, and the underpinning of the Canadian Constitution. I'll take the next slide. Those sacred 7 gifts that we're organizing a methodology for Western science and Indigenous cultures to engage one another, specifically through the academic lens. And that's one of the things that we need to really start refreshing, is how do we work as Indigenous people with the world of academics? And I think that's how we're going to make positive conservation change, but we also need to understand how we enter that agreement together. I think that's really important. This methodology was also founded on a parallel governance with Western business model on one side and the old traditional governance on the other. The goal is not to blend them, but to allow both disciplines to thrive. Ethical space is everything between those parallels, which bridges them to, bridges can exist. For example, the smudge is equivalent to the gavel, and the 7 sacred gifts are equivalent to Robert's Rule of Order. And for those who don't understand what Robert's Rule of Order is, a guide for running meetings effectively and efficiently based on the procedures used in British Parliament. Next slide, please. So guidance on achieving ethical space, this is some of the things I remind people when they ask me to help facilitate these meetings, is Remember, the knowledge systems are to be shared in a space that are complement to each other, not to validate or limit the other one. Most certainly not dominate or command the other one. Should be co-facilitated by a knowledge keeper or an elder from each knowledge system. Try to create a balanced circle, and the first gathering of minds should be focused on the relationship building interaction, not the business side. Learn and share from each other, and that's where hopefully after we're done the pandemic, that's where we can really start making this happen. Is that we get together, and we actually start to just make friendships with each other. And I often find that when I bring new people to different projects I'm in, and they get, I don't know if they get upset or uptight. But like the first hour and a half is just us all catching up, not really actually talking about anything. Just like, how's everybody's families doing? You know, have you been out fishing, hunting, camping? You know, have you seen anything lately? Just to see what everybody's up to. Not so much getting down to business, and that's you know, we usually share a meal when we could gather, but that's a big part of the whole relationship building that I do. It should have both forms of knowledge transfer, the Western written and the Indigenous oral methodologies, and should be open and closed in a good way through the use of ceremony. And that could be multiple practices there. Next, I think I have a question. Yep. So when I said we need to create a balanced circle, what does everybody think that means? So we'll try to hopefully get people more chatty in the chat box, and I'll look to Mackenzie for this in a second.
For sure. Just while we're waiting, I had a couple of comments come in. Ruthie said that she knows she'll have a ton of questions, but she's still waking up. So maybe that's what's going on here this morning. Everybody's still sleeping.
Oh, it's still early, right? 8 o'clock on a Monday. COVID.
And Angela had mentioned that she feels like there's also an issue with settler approaches dismissing Indigenous methods and knowledge. So that's maybe something she's experienced in her work so far.
Oh, I agree with that. That, you know, that's still a challenge that we have to break down.
Definitely.
You know, and I think time will do that. I think the problem sometimes too is that like, you know, like the way we form society is that we expect the outcome to be very quick, right? I often get like, here's our project timeline. They give it to me, and I'm like, hey, that's going to take longer. Like certain projects, you know, now with been doing this 20 years, I'm often like, that's going to take longer than you think because of that topic, right? And that's one thing that we have a real hard time fixing in our minds that we need to work on.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've included my email at the end too, if people want to email me too if they have questions.
Yeah. Okay, so Lauren put in balanced circle, equal or fair representation of both knowledge systems through the amount of people sitting around the table.
I love that. That's a great response. And the only thing I'd add to that too is like how I like to create a balanced circle is that we have a man, a woman lead it. It could be an Indigenous person and a non-Indigenous person be part of the facilitation too to help facilitate that. And that's the only thing I would add to them. That's a great answer. And I do appreciate Lauren saying that. I do. And I'll take the next slide, please.
Awesome.
So then what is Indigenous placemaking then, right? So we've gotten this whole Indigenous ethical space thing, and now we're looking on like, what is placemaking? And this is actually what's happening. I don't know what's happening outside of Southern Ontario since I've been confined just because of COVID to Southern Ontario. But there's a lot of calls for Indigenous placemaking projects. And I don't know if people are seeing that where they are as well. But the focus of Indigenous placemaking is the design and programming of an actual built environment of a settler city. So, and it's actually what's happening is that we're seeing, and I've actually had this said to me quite a few times in a virtual setting where it's like, you go to the GTA and you don't actually know that's an Indigenous place. There's no acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples within the Southern Ontario, and that's something that we're trying to work on. And that's actually what brings in Indigenous placemaking, is that we actually have the ability to actually create. And I have several projects right now where we're creating an Indigenous learning experience through natural trail systems and different park settings, and that's really neat. And so that's actually how you do that, is actually you create a place. Next slide, please. So this is one of my favorite spots. I used to do a lot of work in Thunder Bay. prior to COVID, and I also every time I go to Thunder Bay, I visit this spot, and it's Prince Arthur's Landing, and it's a really great spot at Indigenous art and culture within the town of Thunder Bay. And I always like to acknowledge that. I always go and see it when I'm in town. They have great gardens and everything there too, and it's a really nice spot just to collect your thoughts. And that's what the goal of these places are, to acknowledge the culture, but then also give a connectivity piece for biodiversity and how can animals move along. Next slide, please. Project development and programming through the lens. Your approach in Indigenous context means you're incorporating spiritual and emotional and physical and mental ways of being into an urban development at multiple levels. Urban Indigenous communities have a strong emphasis on collaboration and are grounded in traditional values and principles. Work with the traditional knowledge keepers that live in the city, such as elders and healers, and can provide strong resources on how to create these spaces, right? One of the big things that we often hear is that we're not allowed to do ceremony and different teachings on the land, so you actually help as an offshoot of placemaking create those spaces, right? I'm working on one now in Scarborough where we're going to have an outdoor learning classroom for everybody to use. We're also going to have a ceremonial site for people to use as well, but we're not going to make it so so rigid that you have to actually book the space through a park system. That's not our system on how we do it, but we're actually trying to create spaces for positive change and programming. Next slide, please. So in any work, you need to slow down, and this is we're starting to head towards that project dumpster fire idea, and we need to slow down and not get caught up on the inner workings of projects or your operation. I know people get really excited on the outcomes and they want to share it with the world, and they like tweet it out there and they Instagram it and they Facebook it. And actually I have hardly any of those mediums, so that's why I think my projects go better. But you need to slow down and really get make sure everybody's on the same page before we keep moving the agenda forward. But before you start going to create any form of space, whether it be placemaking or ethical space, I really want groups to start understanding, like, what is their cultural understanding of First Nation reconciliation process? What is the local understanding of the Indigenous communities that you want to build a relationship with? That's really important. Challenges internally with good relationship building, and that's really that takes some time. I've done a lot of work with several different conservation groups, and I'm really always interested when we have those. I hate those questions, but I always like to ask them, like, what are some of the challenges you think that will come about to you building a sense of place? And then they're always like, oh, we're fine, we're perfect. And I'm like, okay, let me take a little look. And then I go through these things. I'm like, have you thought of these challenges internally? External factors that make good collaboration difficult, right? It depends on the time of year. Right now, right, it's hard to build relationships during COVID. But I also look at if it wasn't a COVID year, we'd be getting ready for Little AHL and playing hockey. I'm also a big fisherman, so I'm getting ready to go trout fishing as well as the spring perch fishing. That's what I've been working on at home because I haven't been going out in the ice as much as I like to. But there could be hunting and gathering times that could actually make your collaboration difficult. The knowledge systems and problematic outcomes, I've had people in the past say, we want traditional knowledge, but we don't want it to impact our work, right? That's important, not to have those hangups. I often ask, what is the benefit to the local Indigenous community? Like there's always that it's a relationship, right? So what's the benefit to us versus just a non-Indigenous group? And the big question is the why. Why do you actually want to do this? And organizations really need to start breaking that down, not just from a, well, it's what we're supposed to do kind of perspective, but this is what we can see the relationship looking like. And that's really important as we move forward. And I'll take the next slide, please. So before you venture out on your own, no one should ever believe that there's one size that fits all, and how you create these spaces will be the same over and over and over and over again. As projects change, as people change within the context of the work, you will have to adjust the placemaking and ethical space. You should seek input on how to receive, respect, and translate the diversity of stories, perspectives, and knowledge systems, language and ceremonies, cultures, and understandings, right? It does take some guidance. I'm fortunate to have knowledge keepers as well as well, I call them knowledge keepers on both sides, both an Indigenous and Western science side, who can help explain some of these things. The pressure that a lot of us who do this work feel that we have to have the answer for everything, and that's extremely stressful to be in. So we often have people we refer to as well, and just how do we work through this and make sure that we're providing advice too in a good way as well. And the process to evaluate Indigenous people and their worldviews, right? We don't want to take away, we want to elevate the conversation and create that co-governance structure. And so I'm going to start opening, hopefully we're ready to do some fireside chats. So I'm going to ask the question, if Indigenous people were to have a role in your project, what does that look like? And have you given consideration to constraints to these people that you want to work with? And I'll open it up with that question first.
Nothing yet here, Gary. Maybe people are typing.
Yeah, we'll give a minute or so. I'm okay with that. We have lots of time. I'm actually right on schedule where I want to be. Awesome.
Good. I think you made a really good point, Gary, about that that I had never thought about before, about hunting and gathering, and that those times of year may be difficult times to collaborate. That's a good thing to think about.
Oh, for sure, right? Like certain times of year, I have nothing on my mind but just fishing.
Right.
Right. I just don't want, like, it's like, and it's funny because like today I actually start kicking off my field programs, which I can't believe. I don't know if it's COVID time or just I don't believe it's March. And you know, it is only March 1st, but yeah, in a couple of weeks I'm like, oh my God, like it's totally like full blown fishing. Maybe because I've been cooped up all winter and the ice where I live isn't safe to go on, and I'm a pretty big guy, so I'm afraid of falling through. But it's that whole like, let's get outside and start doing stuff, right? And I think another challenge we're going to have as we all receive vaccinations and we're all able to come back together is that we might want to take a break from project work and just celebrate being all together again, right? And I think that'll. Sure. And I have actually warned people about that I foresee that happening as we're able to gather again and we can bring our families back together. That might delay some things, but it's all in a meaningful way at least.
Right. Okay, I have some responses coming back to your question here, Gary, so I'll start going through those. Megan said, for constraints, perhaps the mental energy for communities to take on a project, trying not to approach the project as something they should do to help you.
Yeah, I actually really like that. And that's a thing too. Like we get bombarded with projects as Indigenous people especially through the duty consult, and hopefully that people are getting that this isn't about the duty consult. This is about protecting nature through a different lens. But that it is a lot to take on. It's funny because I've been really stepping back during COVID and understanding how involved and busy I am, and it's just you know, overwhelming, and I've had to reset as well. And I've looked at like, hey, it's okay if I don't get it done on a Saturday morning. I can hopefully get it done on Monday, and that's part of that's like the mental strain that we have to do. And it's also some of the stuff that's going on in our territories does take away from positive conservation, right? And people need to know that too, and just give us more time.
Right. Lorraine mentioned co-leadership and having Indigenous people as a co-leader on projects. A little comment. Francine says, I think sometimes that not knowing how to engage with Indigenous peoples can paralyze considering what their role looks like. I think we might need to just ask them what role they would like to play.
Ooh, I like that statement. That's a really good one.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks, Francine. And she also mentioned, good comment about relationship building. That is just the first step.
I think we can move on to the next question, Mackenzie, if you want.
Sure, yeah.
So how do you go about making room for Indigenous people in your daily work or projects? That's a really hard question. I like to add that. I might actually make that a final exam question.
Gary, while we're waiting for some responses to come in, do you have any tips on how people can start that conversation?
Yeah.
If you're trying to develop a new relationship.
Yeah, like I do it. It depends on who I work with. I do it in various ways. I like to, you know, COVID was a big deal to how I do things. I like to get people together in the room and you know, like we're looking at different projects right now. Like I'm looking at projects with American eel, different fishes within like, you know, walleye restoration, different species in the forest community. So like, you know, maybe post out there like, hey, you know, like look at the urban Indigenous population, but look at the treated communities as well, and say, hey, what's going on? Like, are you interested in these projects? I like to take youth on training. I often accredit who I became in my career through one of my relatives, Dorothy. She gave me one of my first jobs as a fisheries biologist, and I've kind of skyrocketed ever since then. So I often make a point to take youth on training to show them that this is a career you could do as an Indigenous person, and how much fun you can have doing that, right?
Yeah.
You know, just getting people out in the land to talk about things is really important as well.
For sure. Megan had a response to your question about making room. Oh, I lost it. Sorry, there's a bunch of comments coming in here. Megan says, to make room, you have to build it right from the beginning and not think of it as an add-on.
Right, and I think I'll add to that. It's not value added, right? It's part of our responsibility of getting along, and that's actually why we signed treaty. Was that how we actually work together to live together, and it's not a value added process. That was a good comment. Definitely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Lindsay says, be respectful of their lives and timelines. Their methods could be different from your methods, and respecting that is essential.
For writing these down. I think these are really good, and that is the big part, right? Like, how do we? I often find it funny, right? When I was like working, and people wouldn't respect that I was on vacation, right? I'm doing stuff I take a vacation at various times around certain things I want to do on the land, and people just wouldn't respect that, and that's so important to understand that.
Right. And that's important for everyone, I think. Okay. Do you maybe want to move on to the next one, Gary?
Sure, that'd be perfect.
Okay. Get this going here.
So what does reconciliation mean in the context of the work you do, or in how Canadians operate today? And we could put this through a conservation lens, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm. A comment came in that I think kind of relates to this question, maybe more so than the last one. But Ludmilla had said that the Indigenous people are experts on the land and would play a very important role in any projects in conservation.
Oh, for sure. That's a great comment.
Mm-hmm. Lorraine says, in context, I keep scrolling past as more things come in. Oh no. In context of the work I do in conservation, and actually everything, reconciliation mainly means relationship building.
Yeah, for sure. And the one thing I do want to share with people is, as we go through the path of defining what reconciliation really means, is that make sure when you're starting to look at conservation and how to build these protocols and frameworks, that you really understand the framework of the treaty that you're in the area you're working in, because you could be actually violating the rights of Indigenous people through your conservation effort, and you're not aware of that. So make sure that people start taking time to look at that, so that we're able to create that reconciliation space. Because I look at a lot of different land trust and conservation easements in my territory, and inadvertently through their programming, they're actually violating our rights to access the land, and through different projects, which they had no clue that they're doing that. And we've had to work through that to break some of those barriers down, because we don't want them to face a legal challenge like that as well, especially since they're trying to do a good thing and protect the land.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah, relationship building, and I think learning for everyone too.
Right. So I guess we'll take it to the next slide, and we can start wrapping time up, I think.
Sounds good. There we go.
So thoughts to leave you with, you know, and help the paradigm shift in the conservation sector, is that we all truly have the responsibility to be stewards of the land. We need to create some space where all are welcome. We recognize the intricate role of Indigenous people as leaders in conservation. Respect the rights and responsibility and priorities of an Indigenous community. Maximize conservation outcomes, and build support and participation for conservation with the broader community. And there you go. And that's it. Miigwech, thank you for coming out today. And there's my number and my email. And if you, I don't have a website yet for my company, that's in the works, but you want to add me to LinkedIn, you know, and if you have any questions after today, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm always here to answer them.
Thank you so much, Gary. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us here this morning and to kick off our forum. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Oh, no problem. It was great to be here.
Sure. And thank you to everybody who participated in the questions. See if I can get this working for me here. Next, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Sarah Rang, who is the Executive Director of the Invasive Species Center. And she's going to give a few welcoming remarks.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Yeah. And welcome.
I just have a little introduction for you, Sarah.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
Sarah joined the Invasive Species Center in 2019 with an extensive career in strategic coordination, planning, and implementation of programs. She's collaborated across all orders of government and has over 28 years of experience in environmental policy. She brings with her a passion for environmental protection and a commitment to collaboration. And welcome, Sarah. You can go ahead and take it away.
Thanks very much, Mackenzie, and thank you, Gary, for your thoughtful comments and very helpful to all of us who are working in the conservation space. So thank you for that, and thank you, Mackenzie, for all your work to make today happen. My name is Sarah Rang. I'm the Executive Director of the Invasive Species Center, and delighted to welcome you to the Invasive Species Forum this morning. It's a great opportunity for us to come together to refresh our partnerships, to learn some new tools and techniques, and also to help plot our work as we move forward. So welcome to all to the Invasive Species. We've got an incredible lineup over the next 4 days. We've deliberately scoped the agenda very broadly. You'll see sessions on aquatics and forest health, and back again to you know, different wild pigs. So we've really tried to provide you with a broad range of different activities. So I hope you take advantage of it, and there'll be panels and presentations over the next few days. And please join in each and any one of the sessions that you'd like to. So we've put it as separate sessions so that you can join individually for that time. And know that all of you are going to be eager participants. What I'd like to do this morning is just to share a little bit of knowledge about the Invasive Species Center, give you a bit of an update on some of our current activities, get just a little bit of informal feedback in terms of some work and activities. And then around 10:15, Minister Yakabuski will come on and make some welcoming remarks. And then Helen Roy, who is our keynote speaker, will take it over around 10:20 or 10:25 or so. So that's kind of the format, but I'll just share with you a little bit of information about what's going on at the Invasive Species Center. So I have a bit of a presentation that I'll put up now. And I'm hoping you're seeing my screen.
I just passed control on to you, Sarah.
Okay, and I just took it, so I'm thinking that the screen should be up.
Yeah, and you can just go into presentation mode and we'll get you in full screen.
Okay, sorry, on mine that's blocked, so 1 second. Here we go. I'm thinking that should work now.
Perfect.
Okay, welcome everybody, and this is just a little bit of a recap on the Invasive Species Center activities. So many of you may be familiar with the Invasive Species Center. We're a not-for-profit organization. We're headquartered in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. We really had a mission to connect stakeholders, knowledge, and technologies to help prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species. And those are those that harm, Canada's environment, economy, and society. We're delighted that this year is our 10th year anniversary, so we're planning a series of special events for 2021 that I'm hoping that you'll join in with us. We've worked at the Invasive Species Center in terms of defining our priority outcomes, and they fall really into these three main baskets. The first one is to increase and diversify investment in invasive species management. The second one is to help catalyze action, and the third is to share knowledge. So I'll just walk you through a couple of updates in each one of these areas. So we do a lot of work on the first one, trying to build the case for investment in invasive species prevention and management. And we do that through really quantifying the costs and the impacts of invasives, and to help build a business case for investment in invasive species. So we work with a large number of partners on all of our projects, and this one included. We also work to catalyze action. So we have a series of priority species that we work on. We also work a lot on different pathways, and again, in partnership and collaboration. We work a lot on sharing knowledge, trying to work through a growing network of partners. We've also instituted, like so many, a new webinar series in terms of trying to get some knowledge of invasive species and spread the tools and techniques that can be helpful to all of us. In pre-COVID days, you might have seen us and these kind of presents. That's Mackenzie there, and at a number of different exhibits that we used to go to in terms of all the conferences, just trying to answer people's questions on invasive species. In case you haven't had a chance to visit our new website, it can provide some resources that might be helpful to you in your daily work on invasives. You'll find best management practices, species profiles. Just draw your attention also to risk assessments. We do have a database or a library of all the risk assessments that have been done on a particular species. So if you're looking for a particular plant or animal or forest pest, you can type in the name and it will give you a list and a link to all the risk assessments that have been done on that species. So that might be helpful to you in your daily work. We've also got a number of different technical resources there, as well as newsletters and more. So just to give you a quick highlight on 4 of the projects that we've currently got running this year. We've been working a lot in terms of the first basket, quantifying the cost and impacts of invasive species. And this is work that many of you helped us with in terms of trying to quantify the estimated expenditures on invasive species at the local level. And we sent out a survey, and these are basically the results that came in terms of the total estimated expenditures by municipalities and conservation authorities was about $50 million a year. And that is across Ontario. And then we broke it down by both municipalities, and you can see the estimated average expenditures there being around $200,000 a year. But wide ranges, depending on where you are in the province, about $1 million a year being invested in urban areas, about $200,000 at the county level, and about $29,000 at the township level. And from the conservation authorities as well, it was around $315,000 being invested every year in invasive species. We do believe that this is the first estimate of local investments and expenditures at the local level. These, of course, are underestimates. They don't represent the investments that are being made at both the provincial and the federal level, and by many organizations such as yours that are on the line today. It does, however, give us a good example of the scope and scale of the expenditures at the local level. When we take a look at what municipalities are spending their invasive species money on, you can see top of mind is the emerald ash borer, which has been incredibly expensive for many municipalities. They've had to remove and replace many of their sort of key trees in many of their communities. So about a $30 million cost there. And then you take a look at the zebra and the quagga mussels combined, it's about $9 million there as well at the municipal level. Of course, that doesn't include the expenses that are also felt by many industries as well in terms of keeping their water intake pipes clean. Gypsy moth around $4 million a year, and gypsy moth had a very big summer this summer. I'm sure your phones were ringing off the hook like ours were. And certainly we're expecting a similar kind of thing this summer in terms of a big gypsy moth cycle in Ontario. So large amounts of funds being spent on gypsy moth as well. Then you'll see Phragmites lower down, and we are working with a number of different groups to try and get more recent costs in terms of Phragmites. So stay tuned for some more information here. And then the remainders are a variety of sort of plants and sort of forest pests as well in terms of that municipalities are spending time and money in terms of managing. And you'll note a few of them are like wild parsnip and giant hogweed are known as well from their sort of health and safety perspective. We've started some new work with a number of different partners on green shovels, and this was coming together sort of 6 conservation organizations, Ducks, FOCA, Nature Conservancy, OFAH, and the Ontario Turtle Conservation Centre. And we came together to offer projects at a size and scale and scope that would be of interest for federal and provincial stimulus and job creation planning purposes. So this really is a collaborative effort. It's helped coordinate by ISC, but it really is the work of many different partners, and you'll be hearing some of that about it in the days ahead, and as some of these partners talk about the work that they're doing here. So many thanks to MNRF for supporting the Green Shovels projects. And there's 2 particular projects that we've been working on very intensely. One is the Phragmites strategy. Our goal here is the improved coordination and implementation of frag management in Ontario. So many of us have been working together to draw together case studies, put together a collaborative framework, work on an economic analysis, and help support some of the projects and some of the communities that are doing great work on the ground and on the landscape. You'll hear more about that from Eric Cleland in our in-depth session on Wednesday morning. So please join in if you have a particular interest in Phragmites. We've also been working on innovative tools, and the idea here is to try and help Ontario be a leader in tools and techniques of invasive species management, and really geared towards land managers. So some of the tools that we're working on and partners are working on is increased forest health training. OFAH is working on wild pig webcams in association with Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. A group of us are working on genomic tools, and always interested in how can we improve the mapping of invasives as well. Many of you are very familiar with Phragmites, and it's marched across to sort of southwestern Ontario, and we're seeing it also in northern Ontario near the Invasive Species Centre in Sault Ste. Marie, and also throughout some of the wetlands in eastern Ontario. So just to say that many of the partners who have been involved in Phragmites management are beginning to see some interesting and encouraging results in terms of management of Phragmites. And again, if you have an interest there, please join in on Wednesday. We also work a lot on new communication, training and outreach opportunities, really as a way of spreading the word about invasive species. So we create social media and communication campaigns. We're always looking for partners and other networks, so don't hesitate to contact us if you'd like to join in or partner in terms of a communication campaign as well. Well, a lot of the work that we do is in training and support. So we're providing tools and resources to land managers, you know, at the municipal level, the industrial level, and also different private landowners as well, on how they can help manage the priority species and also their land as well. So we've been working a lot on oak wilt, which is a new forest a pest that is really of concern, not yet in Ontario, but knocking at the door of Ontario, and has the potential to really damage our oak trees, which are the foundation of many of our municipal communities and many of our forests as well. We've worked a lot on Hemlock woolly adelgid as well, which again is a forest pest that attacks hemlock trees, which is important from a wildlife and ecological perspective as well. Spotted lanternfly is again not yet found in Ontario, but is again knocking on the doors of Ontario and has the potential to really cause damage to many of our agriculture and other sectors as well. And you'll find some sessions during the next 4 days of the Invasive Species Forum on these particular ones. So if you're interested, never heard about it, but interested in learning about it, please join in those sessions. We've begun some work with the Anishinaabe Nation in terms of learning what their needs might be on invasive species management and prevention on some of their communities, and begun that process that Gary talked about so well and so meaningfully this morning in terms of, you know, how to start those conversations about invasive species. And we're very proud of our new community of practice to help municipalities. It's a peer-to-peer mentoring program for municipalities, so you can ask and have your questions answered from a community of your peers as well. So if you're a municipality on the audience today, please just take a look at our website and join in terms of the community of practice. Like many of you, we work a lot on technical advisory committees and trying to partner to increase our effectiveness on invasive species. So we work a lot on Asian carp with many different colleagues and partners in terms of holding our recent public information meetings and webinars as well. Last week was our Invasive Species Awareness Week, which many of you participated in and partnered in. And again, it's a collaborative event in terms of trying to use all of our joint energy to draw attention to invasive species. And this week is the Invasive Species Forum, and we're also involved in creating a couple of new working groups on some of the critical emerging forest pests that we see. Just to give you an example of work, pre-COVID work that we did at ISC, we do train land managers on how to detect hemlock woolly adelgid, and this is a very fun kind of technique if you've never tried it, in terms of slingshots and Velcro balls, which actually can detect the kind of woolly nature of a hemlock woolly adelgid. It looks like the sort of top of a Q-tip kind of thing. So we trained a series of land managers in the Niagara region, which is the only known area right now where we have hemlock woolly adelgid, and really want to work together with folks to keep it that way. We've worked in Sault Ste. Marie locally in terms of developing an invasive species exhibit, and we've also worked on oak wilt in terms of training foresters and arborists as well for different techniques on oak wilt management. We're very interested in the ability of citizens and communities and to help in terms of early detection and rapid response on invasives. You know, there really can be our early eyes on the ground and very important in terms of local control of invasives. So with many groups, we worked on the Early Detection and Rapid Response Network, which is coordinated by ISC, but really is the work of many different partners. And we really are training volunteers and giving them the skills that they need to identify and then spot and detect and help reduce invasive species. So we're very proud of our project with partners in the Eastern Ontario Model Forest area, where we have been rolling out this program and will continue to work with partners in that area. We also do work on different diagnostic services, so more the sort of technical end of invasive species. We have the ability to offer insect identification if that's of interest, and also training programs in terms of training people of how to identify different insects as well. We do zooplankton identification, and both for zebra and quagga mussels, and also spiny water flea. If you have lakes that you're wondering in terms of what is in those lakes, we do offer zooplankton identification as well. And this year, as I mentioned, it's our 10-year anniversary, and so we're excited to provide small micro grants for education and communities across Ontario. And we'll also be offering boot brush station contest giveaways. So if you're part of an organization that you're interested in having a boot brush station at one of the trailheads that you have or on your land as well, please just let us know. We will be running a boot brush station kind of contest and giveaway through 2021 as a way of celebrating, drawing attention to invasive species and helping many of you in the field who are working on invasive species issues. Don't hesitate to visit our website for quarterly newsletters. We do a bi-weekly media scan as well, specific to invasive species, where we highlight the upcoming research and the science on invasive species, and also let you know about any events. So it's a good one-stop way of really getting your information in terms of what's current on invasive species. That's our website there as well. Please don't hesitate to take a look at it. And just really wanted to close to see if there's any advice that you have for us or thoughts. Please don't hesitate to reach out to any of the invasive species team that is helping coordinate the sessions over the next 4 days. And really, we're hoping to use these information from these sessions to help guide our work, help make partnerships with many of you today. So, we're always open and welcome your advice in terms of the activities at the Invasive Species Center. So if you have thoughts or ideas for us, we're all ears. And this is how a couple of contacts. There's additional ones available on our website. So you can always contact us through our info@invasivespeciescenter.ca line. Those are my personal contacts. But as well, we have a great team at ISC who have a very large amount of knowledge in terms of different invasives, and so don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. So I'm going to close there and really open it up to any questions for about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll move on in terms of the minister's kind of welcoming comments as well. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Mackenzie, for any comments or thoughts.
Thanks, Sarah. Does anybody have any questions? You can submit them to the question box and I will read them to Sarah. We do still have a couple of minutes before our next speaker, so if you don't have any questions, you can maybe take this opportunity for a bathroom break or to refill your coffee, and we'll be back in a couple of minutes with our next speaker, but until then, we can take any questions. Looks like you did a good job explaining everything, Sarah. We haven't got any questions.
Well, I guess I have a couple of questions for the audience. You know, is there any advice that you'd have for us at the Invasive Species Center in terms of activities that are important to you? Are there any ways that we can help support you in terms of your activities as well? You know, we are anticipating a very busy summer, and also, you know, think that sometimes when things flare up, such as gypsy moth, which we'll probably have again another busy summer on, it's always useful to have a sort of a network of groups that can help answer those kind of questions. So interested in anybody who has any advice in terms of our activities, but also any things that they're seeing in terms of 2021 kind of challenges as hopefully we move to a different kind of summer than we had last summer.
Okay, we've got a couple questions coming in now. Helen, who is our keynote speaker, asked if, she firstly said fantastic overview, and asked if we collaborate with other similar centers around the world. They have a fantastic secretariat in the UK.
Yeah, we try to collaborate with as many people as we possibly can, including globally. We are the secretariat for the International Conference on Aquatic Invasive Species, ICASE as it's known. So that's one of the main ways that we link ourselves up globally to a number of different organizations. So currently we're working with Netherlands and Belgium in terms of looking at hosting that conference as well. So that's one way we connect ourselves up more globally, and always interested in other ways as well, because so much of our information is helped when we take a look at a more global kind of perspective. Some of the invasives we have here are native elsewhere, so we can really learn a lot by working on that global kind of perspective. So always interested in that, Helen, and thanks for the suggestion.
The next question for you, or maybe comment, Ruthie says, public identification is really important for the general public. I found most of my students do not know how to identify species in all stages of its growth.
Yeah, identification is tricky, as many of you may know, and you know, you can look at the picture in the guidebook and the thing in front of you looks totally different, and sometimes that's just because you're in a different part of the sort of region, but sometimes it's the different part of the season as well. So identification certainly is a skill, and it's one of those things that just gets better with practice. But we are looking at trying to increase people's abilities to identify insects accurately, because that's really how you have to start. So we are looking at trying to do some additional photos and guidebooks in terms of actually providing that technical information on insect identification that that's really the root of starting an invasive species program, because if you don't know what it is, it's also, you know, hard to start. And, you know, that's really also, I think, the success of some of the community action and having those eyes on the ground. You know, many of the species that we found have been the result of communities or an interested person just saying, hey, that bug looks pretty weird. You know, I wonder what that is. And then we found out that it's actually a, you know, very important invasive insect. And so, you know, two things I think are important. One is having communities and people that are interested in looking, and that's community action and science programs that we can work on together. And then providing them with the tools where they can actually figure out, you know, what is it that I'm looking at.
Definitely, Sarah, I agree with you. The next question is in regards to boat wash stations. Alex says they're interested in doing boat wash stations in their area. It would be helpful to have a section with instructions on how to set these up and suggestions for setups at different price points.
Well, I'm delighted that you're thinking of setting up a boat wash station. That's really amazing. And, you know, we'd be pleased to talk to you offline about some suggestions on how to do it. And there's a large number of organizations that have expertise in this area. And also across Canada and the US, there's a large where they're very experienced in terms of running boat wash stations. There's lots we can learn from different parts of Canada and also different parts of the US in terms of what works in terms of volunteer outreach and, you know, how to make it friendly enough that people want to use a boat wash station, and at the same time make it effective enough that you're actually reducing invasive species. So totally hear you that this is a growing area of interest in Ontario, and we'd be pleased to have a further conversation and talk to you a little bit more about that, because it's really an important one. You know, trying to keep clean lakes clean, keep zebra mussels out of some of those inland cottager lakes is a critical priority. And certainly with aquatic weeds and the spread that we're seeing of aquatic weeds in many of the inland lakes in Ontario, it really emphasizes your great efforts to set up a boat washing station. You know, happy to talk with you further.
Thanks, Sarah. We have some people looking forward to the boot brush stations, which is great to hear.
Yeah, no, I'm totally excited about you know, celebrating an anniversary in a way that helps you in your daily work in terms of invasive species. And there's so much great work going on on the ground level of invasive species, and some of it just needs a small, you know, modest support to really make it take it to the next level. So we're excited to offer boot brush stations as part of our ISC 10-year anniversary. And if folks are interested in that, please just shoot us an email. We will be doing a formal kind of launch a bit later, but you know, you've got the early scoop as well in terms of trying to get the boot brush stations out to at least, you know, 10 communities across Ontario.
Sarah, we still have a couple of minutes here just to wrap up, but there was a question about our work with Anishinaabe Nation. I know that project is pretty new, but I was wondering if you had anything more to share on that.
Sure, we're just starting the conversation really with the Anishinaabe Nation in terms of what might be some of their invasive species needs in their communities. So as Gary suggested, we're trying to, you know, slow down and listen and do those things. So we've just started a kind of conversation there in terms of getting a sense from the different communities. There's 39 different communities. Some are Great Lakes communities and some are inland communities, as to what they're seeing on the landscape. You know, what are the pressures that they see from invasive species? Some have Phragmites, some don't. You know, there's a variety of different needs in terms of those communities. So we're just at the beginning stages of that kind of conversation in terms of really learning what might be the interests and how the Invasive Species Center might be able to provide some resources, either of the technical nature or in terms of just talking through some of the different options as well.
So Professor Helen Roy is an ecologist at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. Her research focuses on the effects of environmental change on insects and other species. She has worked extensively within the field of invasion biology. Her research on invasive non-native species has received international recognition, and she's currently leading a global assessment on invasive non-native species for the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Helen's presentation today will be our keynote address, and it is titled Predicting the Arrival and Spread of Invasive Alien Species, Global Perspective. The number of invasive non-native species arriving and establishing in new regions globally is rapidly increasing. Predicting future invaders is pivotal for informing strategy and prioritizing action to reduce the threat of invasive non-native species. Here, Helen will describe an evidence-based horizon scanning method to identify and prioritize invasive alien species that has been implemented for Great Britain, Europe, and the UK overseas territory. And with that, Helen, I will let you take it away. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mackenzie. Can you see my screen okay?
I can, yes.
That's wonderful. And I just wanted to say as well, if the minister arrives and you wish to pause my presentation, I can do it in 2 halves or however we want to divide it. So don't hesitate to say if that works better for the minister. It wouldn't be a problem for me.
Okay, thanks so much, Helen.
No problem at all. And thank you so much for inviting me to be with you all today. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And I've really enjoyed listening to the previous presentations and to see the amazing work that's going on through the Invasive Species Center. It's really, really impressive, and lots for everyone else around the world to learn as well. So thank you for that. So my presentation today around predicting the arrival and spread of invasive alien species, and hopefully to give a global perspective. Of course, it's not just my work by any means. It's a collaboration with many, many others. And here are just some of the people who've been involved recently in an exercise to do horizon scanning for Britain, and also to thank so many of the funders who provided, well, not only the resources for us to be able to do this work, but also inspirational guidance along the way as well. I'm going to talk quite a bit about some of the very unique places around the world, which happen to be UK overseas territories, and some of the amazing people that I've met as I've been traveling to these places and working alongside them to make these predictions around which might be the next species to arrive and threaten their unique ecosystems. And it's just been such a pleasure to work with them, and I want to acknowledge all of them and to thank them all for their incredible contributions. So I think that we're all aware that biodiversity is declining faster than at any other time in human history, and certainly the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Global Assessment, published in 2019, produced the evidence to demonstrate that, and indeed gave the headline figure that there were 1 million species on the verge of extinction. So it does seem quite a gloomy and depressing picture, but I think, all that we've heard this afternoon shows the great hope that we have that we can be involved in the change that's required to address the balance and to improve things dramatically going forward. And I think we have such a good understanding now really of the drivers behind this biodiversity change. We know about the important drivers around land and sea use change, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, and of course, highly relevant to us here is the topic of invasive alien species. And we know that these different drivers act in different ways in different systems, so they're not having the same effects in terrestrial, freshwater and marine systems. And we also know that there's a whole variety of other indirect drivers that are coming in and creating a very, very complex picture. So we know that context is all important, and having this understanding is all important. But I think that what the IPBES assessment from 2019 showed is that drawing together all of that evidence and sharing that information, including around Indigenous local knowledge, which is so important to informing the picture of where we are with these biodiversity change, we can really begin to think about what changes we need to make to address the problems. So I'm really very privileged to be one of the co-chairs of the IPBES thematic assessment on invasive alien species and their control. And this assessment will be delivering in 2023. It's progressing really well, and maybe some of you were involved in reviewing the first order drafts that were published towards the end of last year. And if you weren't and you want to register and get involved with reviewing the second order drafts, you'll have an opportunity later on through this year, and it'd be great to have your involvement. But it's really amazing to be working with so many experts from around the world and bringing together lots of different knowledge systems to inform this synthesis of information around invasive alien species. We're just at the moment in the middle of working on the summary for policymakers' first order draft, so it's incredibly exciting. I think it's really important at the outset to be clear on the definitions, and obviously non-native species that have been introduced from one part of the world to another by humans, and it's that human involvement that's really important. And we know that a subset of these non-native species or alien species go on to have some kind of impact, and that might be on biodiversity, ecosystems, economies, or indeed society, or indeed for some species, all of those different things. And one of the species that I've studied a lot is Harmonia axyridis, the harlequin ladybird. And this is a species that was first recorded in the UK in 2004. And we set up a citizen science project to track the spread of this species, knowing there was nothing we could do in terms of direct action after it had arrived. And it was really just incredible to see how people got involved. And the map that you just saw through that animation shows all of their records and shows this dramatic spread of this ladybird through England and into Wales and to the northern parts at about 100 kilometers per year, which is really staggering. And this species is one that we would most definitely term invasive. It's the impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems are really quite concerning. So we were able to look at some long-term data sets to assess the impact of the harlequin ladybird on some native ladybirds, not only in Britain, but also using data sets from Belgium as well. And we were able to show that, and I won't go into all the detail of all of these panels, but as a consequence of competition and predation, that the harlequin ladybird would affect 7 out of 8 of these species, and was already showing a strong correlation in distribution declines of 7 out of 8 of these species. And in particular, one of our little ladybirds, the top corner there, Adalia bipunctata, showing a 44% decline in distribution following the arrival of the harlequin ladybird. And of course, we can then think about the adverse effects that might have in terms of ecosystem function and resilience if we see a complete shift in our ladybird community. And these ladybirds are so important in providing pest control services to farmers and gardeners. That was just a little distraction really to introduce the harlequin ladybird and to be clear on the definition that I'm going to be using throughout of invasive non-native or alien species and non-native species. And I think, you know, worldwide, we've been really good at documenting biological invasions. We have the most amazing data sets now around the world, which show the first records of species in many different places. And within Britain, I lead a project on behalf of the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs and JNCC to gather information on all of the non-native species in Britain and to share information on their biology and also their distribution. And this informs an indicator of the status of non-native species every year. And it's really fantastic. Lots of information comes from volunteers, and the charity organisations, but also statutory bodies and local record centres and many different people, and we compile all of this information. And we know we have more than 2,000 established non-native species in Britain, and we know about 15% of those are really quite problematic. We've been able to share our data set from Britain alongside many, many others from all around the world. And this is a fantastic piece of work conducted by Hanno Siebens and others, where he looked at the first record rate per year around the world and was able to look across different taxa and different regions of the world, and to show that this pattern that you can see on this chart in the center of the slide, where there's just this increase and no saturation in the accumulation of alien species, could be shown worldwide and for almost consistently across taxa as well. But I think in terms of looking at these patterns, what's really thought-provoking is that 25% of the first records during, for instance, this time period 2000 to 2005, they did not have an invasion history anywhere else. And we know that in terms of managing the problem of invasive alien species, the prevention is really the most cost-effective and generally effective approach. But if we don't know what's going to be arriving, then it's very difficult to know how to go about prevention. And so we've been thinking a lot about this question of how can we make some predictions to inform prevention going forward, particularly in light of the fact that some of the species will not have a previous invasion history. So back in 2013, we were asked by the Government Department of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs to come up with an approach for horizon scanning to make these predictions about what would be the next species that could arrive in Britain and threaten biodiversity and ecosystems over the next 10 years. So we decided to take an approach that would combine gathering together the best available information through rapid impact assessments and literature reviewing with what's called expert elicitation approaches, whereby we would gather together groups of experts to help fill in the gaps, because we knew that there would be many gaps in knowledge and understanding and evidence to be able to inform this process. So working together in quite tight groups on plants, freshwater invertebrates and fish, marine species vertebrates and terrestrial invertebrates, we allowed the experts to work together in small groups, first of all, just to come up with long lists of species and to score them on the basis of their likelihood of arrival, establishment and impact on biodiversity and ecosystems, and then to rank those species within their groups. We then combined all of that information into one big database, and we met together with all of the experts so that we could discuss that ranking process. And through those discussions, we were able to come up with a ranked list of invasive non-native species by consensus and using this expert elicitation approach. And it's been really, really fascinating that this process has now been used in many different parts of the world. And I think it is really effective because it does allow those knowledge gaps to be filled by empowering experts to share their knowledge and to look more broadly, perhaps to other taxa that are closely related or to other systems where the species might be found. And combining that with the best available evidence means that we can come up with these ranked lists. But I was very aware that the process that we were using was being used in different places around the world, and I thought it'd be really useful actually to talk about some of the points that we find are really useful in terms of being able to deliver this horizon scanning using expert elicitation in the way that we have been doing. And we were funded by the UK government, their Foreign and Commonwealth Office Conflict Stability and Security Fund, to work with all of the UK overseas territories, of which there are 16 around the world, to come up with these horizon scanning lists for each of those territories. And so then it was really important to make sure that we were very transparent and open about the method that we would be using and the ways in which we would be engaging with one another through these guiding principles. And really, I think the important things are, it's important to have a scope, to know what the scope is of the horizon scanning. It's important to have the simple scoring system so that we can at least find our way around these very, very long lists. But it's important also to review and adapt the process to meet the needs of the experts who are in the room and the things that they might find along the way that would make the system more straightforward for them. Diversity of the experts is really important so that you have as many different views and thoughts and expertise within the room to lead to that well-balanced approach. But it's also important that we acknowledge what we don't know, the limits of the expertise and the gaps in knowledge as well, and that everyone feels empowered to take place and to engage throughout the elicitation, and that we have lots of time to do that, and that the facilitation is fair throughout. So we've been really fortunate to carry out this expert elicitation process in various places around the world, and it's been just wonderful to interact and share experiences and knowledge with experts, and to be able to share the outcomes and document what we've been finding so that it can be used in other places as well. So we've carried out these horizon scannings first of all for Britain, and we published that in 2014. Then we carried out the same approach for the European Union. We also then, as I've mentioned, have carried it out for all of the UK overseas territories. And from that, so far, we've just published the list for the Antarctic Peninsula region. And these prioritized lists have been used in lots of different ways. So, for example, the list that we came up with for the European Union has formed the first basis to select species for a very thorough and comprehensive risk assessment. So it can be, the evidence can be gathered in a lot of detail to see whether any of those species should be included within the regulation that has an annex list of invasive alien species of union concern. But in some cases as well, it's been used for implementing monitoring and action, and we've used a similar process for prioritizing management of new and emerging invasive alien species as well. And the paper led here by Olaf Boy outlines that approach. We've also seen how it's used for enhancing biosecurity, and this has been particularly the case on the UK overseas territories, but also back in mainland Britain as well. So I've already mentioned about defining the scope, and when we first began, we were just mainly looking at biodiversity and ecosystem impacts, but increasingly there was a call on us to begin to embrace aspects of impacts around human health and also economic impacts. So for the biodiversity and ecosystem impacts, I think this is another really important part of these horizon scanning processes. It's important to have clear definitions around when we produce a score of 1 to 5 for the impact of that species. And we've been using the ICAT categories. So this is the environmental impact classification for alien taxa, which has been published by the IUCN. So we've been following their methods to guide us through the classification of the impacts there. For the socioeconomic impacts, we've been referring to the work of Sven Bakker and others through a very similar system, the socioeconomic impact classification of alien taxa, which has also fairly recently been published. And of course, human health impacts are so much in our mind at the moment with COVID-19, and particularly thinking about the role that invasive alien species might play in transmission of zoonotic diseases. And this example, for example, with the mink farms and COVID-19 cycling between the mink and the farm workers, and resulting in devastation in terms of the culling of the mink, but also, of course, a very sort of disturbing reminder of the role that these species can play in transmission. And one of the things that we see as well is that many of the invasive non-native species or invasive alien species have multiple impacts. They have impacts that may impact biodiversity and ecosystems, but also human health as well as economies as well. And oh, I don't know why I've got to repeat there. I thought I would just give a bit of detail here around the horizon scanning on the UK overseas territories, partly because I just want to celebrate the collaborations that we made working with people all around the world through this project. So this map shows the location of these territories and these beautiful far-flung islands in many cases. And I already mentioned that we published the Antarctic Peninsula region lists quite rapidly because that was a way in which it could be then more useful for the whole of the Antarctic region by being presented as a working group paper for the Secretariat of the Antarctic Treaty. And I think that's the message from these lists, is that as soon as we've completed the horizon scanning working in these consensus workshops, we make them as available to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. We don't wait until we've published in Global Change Biology, which has been really fantastic to publish there, but we make sure the lists are available for people to start using in whichever ways they see as useful immediately. So I just thought as well, since many of us are in our homes working at the moment around the world, it's nice to think of other places around the world. So I thought I'd share you a few of the pictures and talk about a few of the examples of the invasive alien species that are causing some problems on these amazingly unique places. So this is Grand Cayman, and you can see on the beach there that the seaweed there is causing quite a problem and can really stack up quite a lot on the pristine sands there, and causes problems for tourism, but of course you can imagine there are other issues as well with that. But perhaps one of the sort of most notorious invaders within Grand Cayman at the moment is the little iguana that you can see below that car there, the green iguana. And that species, when we were there back in 2018, there were about 1 million individuals, and it's a species that they were showing was doubling in population on an annual basis. And unfortunately, there is a threat posed as a consequence to the blue iguana, which had been part of a very successful captive breeding and reintroduction conservation project. And now, unfortunately, this green iguana is encroaching on the territories of the blue iguana, so posing a direct threat to this endemic iguana of Grand Cayman. This Turks and Caicos Islands, and yeah, in the Caribbean, the iguanas are really quite spectacular, but as are the beautiful views. And again, they're extremely concerned about the arrival of the green iguana, and there have now been a number of sightings on Turks and Caicos Islands. But the other thing about Turks and Caicos Islands is that it is made up of lots of different islands with quite unique habitats in their own right. And so the spread of some of the species that might arrive on the main islands to some of these even more remote, smaller islands is really of concern. And we've been working with people there to make predictions about which species might be the ones to spread and cause problems within the territory too. St. Helena in the mid-Atlantic Ocean, a really remote location. And what you can see here is New Zealand flax growing through the cloud forest of St. Helena. Now, St. Helena has more than 400 endemic invertebrate species, and you can imagine that this New Zealand flax is really quite a threat to those species that aren't found anywhere else in the world. But it's not just the New Zealand flax, there's a whole variety of other species that have arrived, the harlequin ladybird included, that could be causing problems to the unique fauna and flora there. And this is the British Indian Ocean Territory, and specifically Diego Garcia. And again, just amazing species. And in terms of their marine environments, the longest contiguous marine reef that there is to be found anywhere that is so pristine. It's an absolutely incredible place. And this is in Akrotiri in Cyprus, in the sovereign base areas. And this is where we first introduced the aspect around human health and looking at making some predictions around which species might arrive and impact on human health. And this was through funding from the Darwin Initiative. So from all of this work and all of these amazing places around the world, we were able to compile the list. And as you can imagine, each of the different territories has a unique list. However, there are some species that are really of quite concern in wherever you were to go. And for example, Perna viridis, the Asian green mussel, appeared on many of the prioritized lists from many of the territories, and the frequency of occurrence refers to its occurrence on a list of any of those 3 impact categories: the economy, the human health, and biodiversity and ecosystems too. The little fire ant was Aurora punctata. That was also a species that we talked a lot about, and indeed some of the evidence we had presented to us from where it has arrived and established in Hawaii, and it's causing such problems that actually farm workers have to abandon land because it's just really not pleasant to be around it, let alone then also the biodiversity and ecosystem impacts that that species is having. And then, of course, there are other species on there that won't perhaps be of a surprise at all, such as the mosquitoes as well, but also lionfish there appearing in quite a number of the UK overseas territories. But it's important to remember each and every territory had their own unique list. There's a very complicated figure, and I apologize for that, but I just wanted to show you that we also looked at the pathway information. How could those species be arriving? What would be our predictions about the ways in which they might arrive? And what you can see on this graph, and the tallest bar there, is that containers are seen to be quite a problem in terms of bringing in new species to these places, but also luggage with tourists, the transport of habitat material, which is THM, along the x-axis there, also ornamental plants as well. So lots of different ways in which the species could potentially arrive. And what we then did was we looked at these pathways and the species combination to see which were the pathways that were bringing the most likely to be bringing the most species in to these different territories. And I just wanted to show this slide because actually it shows these sort of pathway action planning and also the way in which these lists can be put into place straight away. So this is in St. Helena, and actually we were stranded on St. Helena because the plane couldn't come and get us because the runway's in the cloud forest and the cloud came down, and so we had extra time on St. Helena. We had a whole extra week almost, and it was just a fantastic pleasure to continue and have another week working alongside people. And actually we were invited to have a tour of the border security, and there was a ship had come in with some containers with the produce, and so we were invited to take a look at how the sorting goes, and really amazing people who are safeguarding this unique island and checking through a really high level of checks that go on before any of the produce will be out for consumption. And we had a very enjoyable afternoon. We actually volunteered, would we be any help if we stayed and helped sorting? And people there were very generous and said, yes, that would be great. I'm not sure how helpful we were, actually. I would be a bit more hindrance, but nevertheless, it was lovely chatting across these tables, sorting through the fruit and vegetables and just thinking about all kinds of things, but in particular, invasive alien species. And you can see in the back there some posters, and they had an office poster where, for example, the lists that we were producing could go straight up into this area for things to be looking out for that could be coming in through those containers. Amazing biosecurity. So as I already mentioned, some of these territories are island groups, and Anguilla and Turks and Caicos are two of those territories. So we've been back to both of those territories to be working around the spread of species and making some predictions about which species could move from one island to another. So these are already established invasive alien species, but then as well thinking about what kind of biosecurity could be put in place to prevent the movement of the species any further than they already have. And the top picture with the looking back to those hills, this is coming across to Anguilla, and all the way through that sort of little inlet was lined with green iguanas just staring at us as our boat went through. So clearly the threat, they don't have green iguana on Anguilla at the moment, but the threat is there and imminent and literally just across the water. So we were looking at the spread within Anguilla, but also we did the same work in Turks and Caicos as well, and coming up with which were the species that were particularly concerning, and where could they survive within those island groups, and what species might they be impacting, and how might they arrive and move around those different islands. Really fascinating work, and absolutely critical to have the expertise of people living there, of the experts in the National Trust, for instance, and in the government departments, and from other NGOs as well. And And it was really interesting hearing the first talk this afternoon from Gary around the importance of just spending some of the time when just sitting and listening and talking with one another and getting to understand different perspectives. And one of the first things we did when we went to each of these UK overseas territories was to have a field visit, so that we would ask the people who were living there to take us out on a field trip, and we could just chat and have lunch together, just as Gary was saying, but also just to hear about the species, hear about the habitats, and hear about the concerns of the people who we then were working with. So just to come back into Britain, where I'm sat at the moment, home working, we repeated the horizon scanning that we had done in what seems like quite a long time ago now, back in 2013. We carried it out again in 2019, and we have the list available, and it's already been used in different ways. One of the ways it's been used is to look at some of the aquatic species and what pathogens could be coming in, hitchhiking on some of those species if they were to arrive. And just to tell you some of the results that have come out from there are some similarities with the list that we had before, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Vespa velutina, the Asian hornet, which has had quite a story to tell since its prediction of arrival back in 2013. But there's a whole variety of different species. And I think what I'm trying to show here is with those figures where it says sort of like 1-10, is that's so the raccoon appearing in the biodiversity list in the top 10. On human health, it was appearing between 6 and 10, ranked between 6 and 10. In the economic list, it was also very highly ranked in the top 20 of species. But for some of the other species, we can see, for example, the Alexandrine parakeet is much further down the lists in terms of biodiversity, human health, and economic, but perhaps it indicates quite the number of species that we're looking at, and the way in which we can rank these species accordingly. The other thing we've also been doing, because the Department for Food and Rural Affairs thought it would be really useful if we could just compile all of those impacts and not be thinking about the three separately, as in biodiversity and ecosystems, human health, and economics, but to bring it all together, and then what would our list look like? And it's a very difficult task, actually. It's very difficult to manage that and to reconcile all of these different impacts into one list. But we did it through another process of expert elicitation and sharing evidence and having these discussions. Vespa velutina, the Asian hornet, comes right at the top there. And it was interesting for me to see the economic costs that were presented from you in terms of managing emerald ash borer, and that certainly is a species that's not yet present in Britain, but we're extremely concerned about its potential arrival. So I just thought I would finish with talking a little bit more detail about the Asian hornet, because it gives another example of how we then use these predictions to inform decision making and communication campaigns. So the Asian hornet, Vespa velutina, is a terrestrial predator. It has a particular fondness for feeding on honeybees, and it arrived in France back in 2004 as a completely random arrival in a pottery consignment. So it wasn't hard for us to predict that because it had spread through France, that it was very likely to arrive in Britain. But it would have been very hard to predict that it was going to arrive in France back in 2004. So once we had gone through this horizon scanning process, it was a species that was very, very high up on the list of concern. And so immediately a surveillance system and monitoring system was put into place, and there was lots of research done around the best and most effective methods of control. It is a species that forms quite spectacular nests, and also very conveniently, all of the individuals go back to their nest at nighttime. And so this means that a whole nest can be destroyed at nighttime if it's found. So we did a lot of publicity, television campaigns, writing in magazines, talks, and we launched an app, the Asian Hornet Watch app. And what we've seen year on year is the number of reports of suspected sightings go up year on year. So we get thousands and thousands every year of people thinking they have seen the Asian hornet. Actually, each year we've only had a couple of nests, a couple of confirmed sightings. So we really are managing to find those couple of sightings amidst these many thousands of reports. And in many ways, we want to keep people reporting to us because we want to know that there's that level of engagement and surveillance out there. So it's really inspiring that they take the time to do this. Most of what they're reporting are the European hornet or a few other species that look quite like the Asian hornet. So far it's been eradicated. We had our first record in Britain in 2016, so that was a few years after our horizon scanning, and every year we've had a few records since, and every year there's been successful eradication. Indeed, one time we had a record came through our alert systems. We also run the alert system that arrived with us on a Sunday, and by the Monday that nest was eradicated. It's really amazing the coordination and communication that goes into this process, and we just play a really small part of that in terms of relaying the information on. It's then what happens with the people who are in the bee inspectorate and others. That's really quite incredible. But what we've also been doing is looking at predicting the spread of the Asian hornet had that eradication not taken place. So we've been able to combine some modelling approaches of distribution modelling and suitability, environmental suitability models, combining them with spread models to predict where the extent of invasion of the Asian hornet might be if we didn't have that early detection and eradication. And we would have seen quite spectacular spread, and possibly up to about a third of the suitable habitat being occupied by the Asian hornet had that eradication not taken place. And we know from studies in France that the impacts on honeybees and potentially wild pollinators as well is really concerning. So just to summarize, predicting invasions is tricky, but it's possible. And using the best available evidence that we have and expert knowledge and expert elicitation processes, we can come up with these horizon scanning lists, and we can then use those to inform other processes such as risk assessment or pathway action planning or biosecurity plans. And we can combine this with modeling, as I've just briefly shown you with the Asian hornet study. But it is the first step. It's really important then to share those results, to communicate and raise awareness. And I think that's where the horizon scanning comes into its own as well, because we've got those groups of experts gathered together from all kinds of different organizations. They're then sharing of what they found, and their part within these predictions is really important. We're also seeing, of course, the importance of collaborations across disciplines, working with people who have an understanding of plant and animal health, human health, as well as ecologists working on biodiversity and ecosystem impacts, but also the people who have the knowledge around biosecurity, and feeding this information through to those people who can actually take action on the ground as well and come up with the plans for these species. It's really is just incredible to work with so many amazing people and to play a really small part within this process. So I want to thank the Invasive Species Centre very much for inviting me to be with you this afternoon and to give this presentation. It's really been great to hear from you, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussions later on. Thanks also to our various funders from the UK government, the European Commission, Cost Action, and also, as I mentioned in my question, the Non-Native Species Secretariat in Britain is a really fantastic coordinating body as well. But particularly to thank all of these amazing experts from all around the world who, without their enthusiasm, dedication and meticulous attention to detail, we would not be able to do this work. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Helen, for this excellent presentation and for joining us this morning. I'm going to ask any questions to Helen to be directed into the next session in our panel discussion because we have Minister Yakabuski on the line now, so I'd like to introduce him and have him join us here this morning. Thank you, Minister, for coming on today.
Yeah, so it's my pleasure really to introduce Minister John Yakabuski, who is the Minister of Natural Resources and Forestry. Many of you will know him already, but you know he has a large interest in conservation and forestry. And he comes from the riding in Eastern Ontario of Renfrew, Nipissing, and Pembroke, where he's well respected for his community service. And he's been a long-standing member of, in terms of the legislature, who was first elected in 2003. And he's been a very important minister in terms of leading some new initiatives at MNRF. And we know him as a big supporter of invasive species prevention and management, and really delighted that he took the time out of his busy day and with the House sitting to join us today. So I want to thanks Minister Yakabuski very much for joining us, and invite him to make some welcoming comments. So over to you, Minister Yakabuski.
Good morning. How are you all doing? I must say I enjoyed the presentation from Helen Roy there. I learned more about Asian hornets than I've known anything in the past, so that was great. Really pleased about that. Anyway, I know I was late. I apologize. I was having a meeting with the Premier, and as you may know, those meetings end when the Premier says they end, not when when I say they end. Anyway, so thank you very much, Sarah, for the invitation to speak here at the 2021 Invasive Species Forum. Certainly, we'd like to be doing these things in person, but this is the way that things are happening with COVID-19. I'd like to begin by congratulating the Invasive Species Centre for 10 great years of working to protect Ontario from the impacts of invasive species. To strengthen our fight against this environmental threat, Ontario established the Invasive Species Centre a decade ago in partnership with the Government of Canada. Excuse me. These invasive species, these invasive plants and animals that we're combating cause significant social, economic, and ecological damage in our province, costing more than $3.5 billion every year. As Minister, one of my main responsibilities is to protect Ontario's biodiversity, and that includes protecting our lands and waterways from invasive species. Working in partnership, we are steadily accomplishing this objective. Further, my ministry and the Invasive Species Centre are working with the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters and the Nature Conservancy of Canada in order to protect Ontario's natural environments for future generations. There is no single government, organization, or nonprofit that can win the fight on their own. Instead, it takes outreach, collaboration, and public participation. We work with non-governmental organizations to promote education and awareness, to carry out monitoring of invasive species, and to conduct management actions. These strategic partnerships have led to projects to control Phragmites, water soldier, and European water chestnut. Projects like these show us we can accomplish what we can accomplish by working together toward our shared goals. While we've had some real success stories in our fight to protect Ontario from invasive species, we recognize there is no room for complacency and that new threats can emerge at any time. We're aware of several new forest pests that are threatening biodiversity here in Ontario. They include oak wilt, spotted lanternfly, and hemlock adelgid. In December 2019, my ministry posted a discussion paper on the environmental registry, seeking feedback on proposed ways we can improve forest pest management here in Ontario. Many of the actions in the proposal represented key foundational work like monitoring and research. Other action reflected new areas of focus that will help with our overall preparedness, including risk assessment and communication. We are developing a pest management strategy to enable the ministry to respond rapidly to infestations and protect our precious forest resources. Another invasive species that poses a significant threat to Ontario's biodiversity is wild pigs. In other parts of North America, invasive wild pigs have caused billions of dollars of damage in each year. They're destructive, they're clever, and they're virtually impossible to eradicate once a population becomes established. Fortunately, here in Ontario, we still have time to protect our province from these four-legged invaders. Our government has taken clear action to contain this threat. We're encouraging members of the public to report pig sightings from around Ontario. We've launched a pilot study to get a clear sense of how widely distributed wild pigs are here in Ontario. The study involves following up on high priority sightings with on-the-ground research techniques, including baited trail cameras and outreach within members of the local community. Experts from my ministry will be going into more detail about the wild pigs pilot study later in your conference. The fight to contain wild pigs really highlights the importance of public participation. We've been extremely impressed with the response from the public so far in reporting sightings, and we wouldn't be able to proceed without their ongoing support. Invasive species can spread in a number of ways, many of which involve human activity. This includes recreational boating, transportation of firewood and forest products, and the aquarium, horticultural, and pet trades. Over the past few years, we've worked with our partners to increase public awareness of the rules regulating invasive species and the actions individuals can take to prevent their introduction and spread. This has taken the form of outreach, education, and targeted compliance monitoring. We've also been focused on increasing staff awareness of invasive species through training, experiential learning, and the development of reference resources and tools. Our efforts also involve assessing risk and applying the tools available in our Invasive Species Act to improve our ability to contain the threat of invaders. Recent work on this includes the establishment of prevention and response plans for water soldier and water chestnut, which allow individuals and communities to help in the management of these invasive species. Over this past year, we've also been considering the regulation of additional species, including wild pigs, under the Invasive Species Act. Invasive species do not recognize international or provincial borders, so the ministry also continues to work closely with our Canadian and US federal, provincial, and state counterparts to address threats to our shared waters and natural environment. I'd like to wrap up today by pointing out once again that preventing the spread of invasive species is a team effort requiring the full participation of governments and nonprofit organizations, and perhaps most importantly of all, it requires buy-in and support from members of the public. The Invasive Species Forum is a great way for those of us fighting against them to share resources, forge stronger ties, and develop more effective approaches for engaging with Ontarians. Once again, I want to thank Sarah Rang and her team at the Invasive Species Center for organizing this year's forum digitally. It's a format that allows us to come together despite the realities of COVID-19. I wish you all a productive forum and the best in year to come, and hope that we can see each all together, face to face, at next year's forum. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, Minister, for those kind words, and we're very happy you joined us today. For everybody else on the line, we're going to start off for our next session coming up next. So I would recommend you join that. It is a panel discussion on how to prepare for future invaders, which if you liked Helen's talk, I think this will be a great segue into lunch. So I hope to see you all there, and thank you again, Minister, for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks,
have a great day.
Yeah, thanks for joining in. Really
I got to figure out how to get out of this now.
You just push the other button.
All these different platforms, you got to figure them all out over by the. Oh, I just found a button that says quit. Thank you.
There you go. Thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Yeah.